Welcome and good evening, everybody, to the New Formations online seminar series, This Conjuncture. This is operating alongside the New Formations special issues on This Conjuncture. Tonight, we are going up until 8 p.m. and we are fortunate to have with us tonight speaking on this topic of racial capitalism. We are lucky to have with us and enjoy to have with us Gargi Bhattacharyya, who is Professor of Sociology at University of East London, the author of Rethinking Racial Capitalism and Crisis, Austerity and Everyday Life, and Anamik Saha, the Senior Lecturer in Media and Communications at Goldsmiths, University of London. Anamik is the author of Race, Culture and Media and Race and the Cultural Industries. Gargi and Anamik will each speak for around 20 to 25 minutes each, and then that will leave us plenty of time for questions and for discussion. In terms of your questions, you're welcome to ask questions either via the chat function, or you can use your microphone, turn your microphone on and ask a question that way. So that's enough from me, I think. So with no further ado, I would like us to start. Anamik, would you like to go first, or Gargi, would you like to begin?
I'm very happy for Gargi to go first. So if I'm happy to do it.
Please go first. We've just been cooking dinner till 2 minutes ago.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, I shall go first. Let's consider me the warm-up act, right? For the big head man. So yeah, thank you so much to New Formations and to Rebecca and Jeremy and everyone else who was involved in putting the seminar series together, and for inviting me to talk about this issue of racial capitalism, the current conjuncture. So again, I guess, yeah, the purpose is to think about what does the current conjuncture looked at when looked at through the lens of racial capitalism. And I guess I want to approach this question. So I'm a media, I research media, I read, write, and teach media. So I want to focus on the topic of media, which I think is a little bit of it doesn't receive as much attention actually in the literatures on racial capitalism. I can think of a few exceptions, not least Gargi's book, but otherwise, yeah. So I want to, by focusing on the media, I think what it does is it highlights, for me anyway, a really interesting contradiction. If I can use that word, because on the one hand, you get governments kind of coming to ascendancy on, let's face it, pretty explicit racist rhetoric about, governments coming to power based on who can talk the toughest talk on immigration, who can act the most brutally towards, boats carrying migrants, who can make the nation, the most hostile towards folk from overseas, whether they seem to have legitimate reasons for migrating here or not. But on the other hand, you have a media and cultural sector that is utterly obsessed with diversity. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think, based on my own research, I'm going to reflect a bit on my research on the publishing industry in the UK. There's this absolute obsession with diversity, about how they can make their workforces more diverse and how they can make their content more diverse. So it's both in terms of the workforce and in terms of media content. And if you switch on Netflix right now, you'll see plenty of Black, brown, Asian people having an absolute whale of a time. We even infiltrated our way into like period dramas, romping around, with everyone else, with our white counterparts. So I think this is, for me, I think, this is a really interesting contradiction, this kind of the way in which in political discourse, it's about, like I say, the more kind of, about, I was going to say implicit, but quite a lot, is a dog whistle a dog whistle if it's an explicit, maybe that's just whistling, I don't know. But, you know, governments, in political discourse, you see more, you know, rampant forms of racism, I think. And in kind of media discourse, it's kind of the opposite in terms of, as I say, workforce and content. And obviously this is driven by economic demands. You know, the cultural industries would not be investing in diversity if it wasn't seen as having economic value. And that might be in terms of trying to meet the demands of audiences and, you know, particularly a new generation of people who are, you know, really, who are demanding more diversity. Invariably, you know, my chat is going to end up being a lot about, you know, Western culture industries, and I apologize for that. But I do think that I don't want to, you know, I think the kind of push for diversity across the globe, and again, sorry to embarrass Gargi some more, but I think Gargi captures this, the way in which, you know, diversity discourse is circulating around the world. And of course, you've got this show called Squid Games, which apparently is, you know, been the most watched show on Netflix, and is, you know, obviously made in South Korea. So these are, you know, there's something going on in terms of audience demands for this. It's, you know, there's not the reticence to have, you know, a black character as a lead anymore. And also in terms of, like, I think in terms of how diversity, you know, is attaining brand value. You know, this is how it helps a corporation's brand to appear more diverse. But also I think as well is that I think, and this is again something I'm kind of saw on the ground of my research, is that publishing media corporations and companies are beginning to realize that their very legitimacy is being challenged if they're not being seen to do, as Sarah Ahmed put it, doing diversity right, you know, doing it correctly. You know, whether that's Disney inserting trigger warnings on their back catalogue, their racist back catalogue, or whether it's media corporations in, you know, across the board releasing statements, you know, pro Black Lives Matter statements, you know, last whenever summer 2020, in a way that I don't think they would have even, you know, they would have done even like maybe 3-4 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. So I think there is something that's happened there. I don't know if I want to call it a conjunctural shift, but definitely a shift within conjuncture. So I want to basically, in my little presentation, which I've just ate up a load of my time, I just want to kind of hone in on this obsession, this fascinating, no, I'm going to use the word obsession because I think it is, this obsession with diversity and what it tells us about the current conjuncture. In doing so, I'm making a case for why media, I think, is an important topic. And I know this feels trivial, sometimes can feel quite trivial, considering especially the forms of racial violence that are being enacted on a daily basis. But I follow Stuart Hall in his essay on deconstructing the popular, you know, that popular culture is a key site of struggle over hegemony. And, you know, I like that point he makes at the end of it. It's where he argues it's where popular culture is where socialism is to be constituted, not outside of popular culture, but inside of it. So again, the question is how do theories of racial capitalism help us understand what diversity is doing in this moment? So firstly, I just want to underline my my understanding of racial capitalism. And, you know, sometimes I hear that, you know, sometimes there can be criticisms of the ways in which racial you know, it's obviously, you know, a big topic right now, and it's, dare I say, the dominant paradigm, a really important paradigm and popular paradigm in race critical theory in particular. And sometimes I see some kind of disdain for literatures that don't cite Cedric Robinson enough. You know, Cedric Robinson, obviously Black Marxism is a foundational text. I don't want to diminish that, but I just want to argue right now, very briefly, I just want to suggest a more pluralistic approach to this idea of racial capitalism, which, you know, and I think this can entail different approaches and perspectives, and I think they would engage with Robinson's work to a greater or lesser degree, and I think that's fine. So for me, if I can very quickly race through, I think 3 or 4 points around what I personally understand racial capitalism to be, and obviously feel free to challenge me on this in the Q&A afterwards, but racism is not an epiphenomenon of capitalism, it's not a byproduct. Robinson's intervention was in arguing that racial division and hierarchy was the essential foundation from which capitalism emerges. So you know, it's the idea that racism and capitalism are two distinct historical forces that are nonetheless inextricably intertwined. And so it's not that capitalism is intrinsically racist. I don't think we go that far, but it is invariably racial in character. Second point is that racial capitalism is a story of differentiation. Again, this was, you know, a Robinson intervention, and it was a direct charge to Marx, who he felt mistakenly saw capitalism as a homogenizing force. Instead, he argues the tendency of capitalism is to differentiate populations according to racial lines, who are then valued accordingly. And then when we factor in the particular dynamics of sexism, misogyny, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on, the question of who is deemed to have value becomes not just more complex, but more urgent, I think. Thirdly, racial capitalism is not a particular type of capitalism, it is capitalism itself. So the point here is, why define it as racial capitalism? And that, as I was going back to the first point, is because of the persistence of the belief that racism is seen as a mere byproduct of capitalism. But also, I think the stress on racial capitalism is needed because of the lack of understanding, particularly in media studies, and those of us who are interested in the political economy of media, that racism itself is a structuring force over the mode of production, which allows a privileged group to profit the most from the commodification of culture. As I said, what I'm going to present to you is going to be based on my research on the publishing industry, and there's a very key text. I won't name it. I don't need to name the names, but there's a very key text in media studies on publishing, one of the few, and it's a huge tome. It's about 300 pages, and it's goes into detail about publishing, how it works, the economic, technological change and transformations that have changed the nature of publishing. And in it, there's barely any discussion of A, diversity, inverted commas, but B, the very kind of the institutional whiteness of the industry. Research shows that publishing is the most privileged cultural sector across the media, and it almost feels willful, this kind of neglect of the lack of diversity in this industry. And so it's a story, publishing is a story about what types of books are ascribed value in order to maximize profits, but it's also a story about how the books that are ascribed value help sustain the position of and the privilege of the dominant culture, who continue to, again, profit the most from the commodification of culture, in this instance the making of books. The fourth point, I'm going to keep this one very brief because I kind of want to finish on this one at the end, is that racial capitalism needs to be understood as ambivalent in nature. And of course, that's Robinson's argument about black radical thought. He's particularly thinking about black radical thought, to use Gilroy's words, as a counterculture, right? But sometimes I think that stress and ambivalence is missing. So let me come back to this question of diversity. So how does, racial capitalism helps us understand this moment of ongoing acts of racial violence, marginalization, exclusion on the one hand, but, how does it think about this obsession? How does it help us think through this obsession with diversity on the other? As I say, the main concern in these literatures is the way in which racial violence is enacted against different populations for the extraction of capital, judged by the ability of certain populations to produce or not produce. But while the focus is on which racial others capitalism excludes, there is a concern in some of these literatures about who is included. So there's an emphasis on who is included within racial capitalism. And this is a key theme in Jody Melamed's thesis on racial capitalism. And this is a quote on how contemporary racial capitalism deploys liberal and multicultural terms of inclusion to value and devalue forms of humanity differentially to fit the needs of reigning state capital orders. And I'm going to argue that that's precisely, it's in that aspect, that dimension of racial capitalism, that diversity as a discourse, if you like, is located. Gargi's book, chapter 6 of Gargi's book, looks at, explores the politics of diversity in relation to consumer culture. And I want to kind of riff off of that, but focus more on the production side of things. So I'm very much interested in the production of culture here. And from there, I think, very quickly, following Gargi's really amazing critical account, I think, diversity, or if you like, global corporate anti-racism, as Gargi calls it, is an attempt to attract consumers through desire. Portraying your brand as inclusive is essentially a form of seduction, a way of attracting racialized populations, even those who are excluded in population. I think that's a really important point Gargi raises. Through capitalist fantasies of consumption. And you see this becomes very evident in kind of the recent critique, the recent critiques of woke washing or woke capitalism that explore how feminist and anti-racist goals are attained through consumption and consumerism. And I know that there's going to be a panel on this in this part of this series in a couple of weeks with Ross Gill, Francesca Sabande, and Akane Kanai, which I'm looking forward to seeing. The fundamental purpose of diversity, then, according to kind of through a racial capitalism lens, is that diversity is there to accrue economic value as a form of marketing to either attract direct sales or more kind of symbolically through accumulating brand value. Gargi's got a great quote here: "Whatever else may be desired or achieved, that's the fundamental purpose of diversity." I just want to kind of shift quickly to illustrate all of this. I want to kind of shift quickly to a very strange and bizarre media story from last year about publishing, which featured, I don't know if any of you know this, it's the story of Tabitha Sterling. Now, Tabitha Sterling was a publisher of a small independent, a pretty obscure independent publisher in Scotland, who it turns out it was exposed by a local anti-fascist group in Glasgow, I think. She was exposed as a white nationalist, as a member of the far-right group Patriotic Alternative. The reason why this obscure publishing house got into the news was because she was about to publish Julie Burchill. And Burchill, who just off the back of paying Ash Sarkar, the journalist, how much money for Islamophobic abuse, kind of pulled her book. She was like, oh no, I can't let my book be published by a white nationalist. You can see the appeal of Burchill's book to Tabitha Sterling, which was called Welcome to the Woke Trials, How Identity Killed Progressive Politics. But what I found really interesting, and this was part of the story, was that Sterling had also published a book called The Colour of Madness, which was a book on Black mental health, edited by two Black women activists who, as you can imagine, pulled their book immediately, news broke. What's interesting is that how The Colour of Madness, this book, was featured in the audio leak that exposed Sterling as a white nationalist. In this clip, she's speaking at a Patriotic Alliance meeting, kind of where she's defending herself after being accused of being undercover Antifa, and in fact, undercover Jewish as well. So she's like at this meeting of white nationalists saying, no, I am a white nationalist just like you. And in this kind of speech, she expresses regret over publishing this book, Colour of Madness. And this is a quote: I do have a publishing company and I've published The Colour of Madness as I need to make money. And that was a very in way to do it. It was bound to get published. It was bound to get on the Jalak Prize long list. I wish I'd never done it because I've only had awful anti-white sentiment from all of them. And it's a very kind of very tearful defense. Needless to say, the publishing industry, that's already on the defensive over, what Greg Dyke might have described as its hideous whiteness. But they obviously, as you can imagine, were very quick to denounce Sterling. But I want to argue that her description of publishing a collection of Black writers as a very in way to make money was simply was following the precise logics of the publishing industry. Sterling appeared willing to compromise her white nationalist belief in order to cash in on the latest trends for Black and brown voices. She was essentially following the business case for diversity, the economic case for diversity. So again, rather than an act of fascism, Sterling in fact was following the very logics of the publishing industry. Now, in some ways, this whole incident fulfills, that argument most famously kind of provocatively made by Zizek, that anti-racism is useful to capitalism. But through the lens of racial capitalism, I think the situation is better understood as illustrating how, and I take this from Ben Pitcher, different forms of capitalism might facilitate or block different forms of racist and anti-racist practice, not least in the context of the culture industries. So theories of racial capitalism help us understand how diversity accrues economic value. And as I've said, millions of times before, it's a way, so apologies for those of you who've heard this, but it's a way, diversity is a way for the dominant culture to appear to meet the demands of minoritized groups while keeping racial hierarchies in place. I'm just going to take that moment to have a little sip. I think I did that thing where I talk really, really fast and you probably didn't get any of that, but anyway. In the last few minutes, I just want to kind of actually go back to this question of ambivalence, because is it as simple as that? Because sometimes, I think the danger with a too top-down view of racial capitalism is that it kind of paints diversity as a kind of instrument to be wielded, that is wielded by the dominant culture for its own, own profit and gain. And following, this research I did in the publishing industry, which involved going on the ground, if you like, and interviewing over 100 people who work in the industry, it was actually from that research I kind of began to understand and see that diversity has a disruptive quality too, especially when it challenges the industry's own sense of meritocracy. So if it's good, we'll publish it was a refrain we heard time and time again. These were editors talking about, why they're not publishing more writers of color. And they said, if it's good, we'll publish it. This was a blatant lie because, it was quite simple, quite easy for us to press a few buttons and say, well, to get but it was quite easy for us to push a little bit and for editors to concede that they have at times published books that they didn't really care for. So that was disingenuous in the first instance. And also what we found really interesting was that despite their apparent belief in the economic case for diversity, they also expressed fears that authors of colour in particular are niche. And our big takeaway from this research, and you probably would have reached this conclusion yourselves, is that in order to get published, writers of colour need to show they have appealed to that the core white demographic, that is the publishing audience. So there's still this sense that authors of colour, authors from the global south and so on, are of niche value. Jo Littler's work is really important here, because in her account of post-racial neoliberal meritocracy, Littler makes the argument that diversity is actually seen as a threat. Publishers are all for diversity until it gets privileged over merit. As one editor said to me, and this is a quote, a direct quote, "I do think that the number of subpar books being published precisely because they're not written by white people, I don't think that's good for anyone." So basically, this editor has identified that some books are being published just because of the racial ethnic identity of the author, and they think that this is leading to more subpar books, which I don't think that's good for anyone, they say. This was one of the more brazen critiques of diversity, but for the most part, it was fascinating to see the mental gymnastics, if you like, that editors, use to describe how, on the one hand, they need to publish more authors of colour. They know that their lists are purely white, and they are deeply, deeply embarrassed by this. After all, you can't get more white and liberal than the publishing industry. But also, they refuse to use the colour of an author's skin as a reason to publish them. So that contradiction there is, it was really fascinating to see the choreography, if you like, the mental gymnastics, as I say, that they would use to rationalize the, publishing of authors of color. We like to publish, we published this author, but, they were good too. They were good. It was that kind of thing. The fact is, publishers are under more pressure to publish more diversely and to do it correctly. And this is being driven by, and again, this is what Jo Littler has identified, it's being driven by popular feminist and anti-racist activisms, which are then amplified by media that all of a sudden see this topic of inequalities in creative culture industries, or the apparent lack of diversity in these industries, as very, very lucrative content. While I'm very, very, very ambivalent about those popular anti-racisms that Jo Littler talks about, the pressure that publishers are feeling was felt acutely during our research. So rather than a kind of Machiavellian kind of hand rub at the prospect of we've got this new audience we can capitalize on, actually what we encountered was stress and anxiety over doing diversity correctly. And I think this anxiety, a part of is sometimes expressed in those as a moral panic over cancel culture, or woke culture, right? That's what it's coming from. I think moral panic in the old traditional sociological sense of the word is right. And I think, as I say, it expresses the anxiety of a dominant culture that is feeling its authority under threat. And in the context of the modern publishing industry, I think this has been the most under threat it's felt in the modern history of publishing. So yes, diversity entails the commodification of race for the dominant culture to profit from, but it's also threatening the established order. As I say, it becomes a threat to the authority of the dominant culture. And I argue that this tension is at the heart of diversity and characterizes the current conjuncture more generally. It's a fusion of racial and neoliberal logics from above that are shaping the making of race in very reductive ways. But it's also being it's kind of being shaped as well from below, from whether that's Stuart Hall's notion of multicultural drift, which describes the slow, incremental, yet nonetheless profoundly transformative ways in which the very fact of multiculture is changing British society in ways that, and I think this was a Hall quote, in a way that Britishness will never be the same before. And a part of that also includes forms of, a kind of form of popular anti-racism, which sees racial representation as a matter of social justice. As I said, I've got some ambivalence about that, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards. So to conclude, cultural industries need to make profit, but they also need to sustain the state. They also, another purpose of the cultural industries is to maintain the status of the dominant culture, or at least keep existing hierarchies in place. And this has led to a complex situation where diversity is concerned. Culture industries need to show buy-in to diversity. And within power structures, this entails an element of either appropriation, accommodation, and at times, dare I say, transformation. And so to reiterate, diversity, I see it as an expression of this particular conjuncture, racial capitalism, specifically racial neoliberalism. I haven't really gone into that. Again, we can talk about what is specific about this moment of racial capitalism in the QA. And so in that sense, diversity is a form of racial governance. It entails a process of commodification and capitalization, but it also has this intrinsic disruptive too. And I think this is the ambivalence of diversity. And through that, we begin getting to what I don't know if this is a bit heavy-handed, but the contradiction of racial capitalism. And, and I think, like I said, I don't want to, I think the best literatures of racial literature kind of capture that ambivalence. They talk about, the way in which it operates from above, but they all acknowledge if you look to use Raymond Williams' term, those emergent tendencies from below as well. And I think, kind of part of the project of racial capitalism, I think, is doing justice to both of those forces. So I think I'm going to finish there, if that's all right. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anamik. I think that's a really interesting presentation there, especially, drawing attention to this, what you call the obsession with diversity, but at the same time, this contradiction, this conflict between diversity on the one hand and this notion of merit on the other. Gargi, would you like to take over, please?
Oh, I need you to let me share my screen. Sorry.
Okay.
Didn't realize that was disabled. I should have asked earlier.
Yeah, let me deal with that.
Thanks, Jem.
I've taken my trousers off. I was thinking one day I'll do a talk and I'll take off all my clothes and that will be the real end of my career. But today is not that day. Only the bottom half I've removed because it's very hot. So I'll try again. Okay,
you can share screen now.
Okay, lovely, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to try and do it like that if you don't mind, because it's otherwise you flap about trying to do the presentation. Okay, conjuncture. I'm really going to try not to be really rude, but it's so hard. Okay, the conjuncture and other old jokes of cultural studies. I did think, conjuncture, that you think about some not very cheerful white blokes sitting around and what they're doing is thinking about the conjuncture. Of course, it's a reminder to think historically about the present. But the core to historical thinking all too easily reverts to repetition, as if historicizing works to render all moments interchangeable. And I think British cultural studies might be particularly prone to that kind of confusion between nostalgia and conjunctural analysis. So I'd like to just kind of start to remind myself, because I'm made in that tradition of nostalgia as well, to remind myself that an attention to the conjuncture always demands also an openness to what is new. And alongside that, an openness to the analytic tools which can register the significance of the new. Not that I'm going to do that today, but I hope we might talk about what those things might be. The reason why I'm a little bit concerned about the kind of nostalgia industry around what the conjuncture might be, because we kind of know what moments we think we're using as our models of conjunctural analysis. For some of us, moments when we were a lot younger and cuter. That's part of scholarly and intellectual nostalgia as well. But that kind of folds into some of the ways in which I think that the use of the term racial capitalism has become a way of talking about a kind of endless repetition, so that attempts to reckon with the histories of racialized dispossession can lead to a freezing of race, as if it's always the same interaction, that if you map back what those histories of violence are, you can see how they cannot be escaped in the present day, which means there's only the same repetition of dispossession again and again, as if that's all that history is. So it's a kind of challenge to us, to everyone. We need to move ourselves about because I can't see the bottom of my slide. Oh, there, that works better. To grasp both the long historical trajectory of racism and the specificity of the conjuncture. And I'm not so sure we're collectively doing so well at that so far. So that's another thing I hope we might chat a little bit about. So I'm going to say a few things about using the idea of racial capitalism as a slightly amended approach to the conjuncture. Some headline ideas, some of which have already been spoken about, largely coming from Cedric Robinson, but also in the broader debate that's happening across the world now, very much led from the States, but some stuff here in other parts of Europe, and a kind of different take up in different parts of the world. So one, the idea that capitalism differentiates rather than homogenizes populations. That leads to some difficulties for those of us who might have been raised in the idea that freedom comes from when we all become the same kind of subject of capital that is the subject that overthrows them. Alongside that, there's no one trajectory of the economic and the accompanying social and political development of capitalism. That's not quite the same as the idea of jumping over stages. It's much more an idea of a proliferation, that what we might think of as moving to entering the market economy in different ways, just different histories, we can't quite tell. And alongside that, there's no one agent of history. So either it's more than the proletariat, a whole debate about that we can't center an idea of the industrial working class. But I think more interestingly, a huge kind of literature now about how we must think of the proletariat itself as multiply constituted. So a whole debate about what does proletarianization mean, how you would decenter of a particular moment of industrial capital as what the marker of proletarianization is, and how we then think those multiple histories into some kind of historical agent, of course, can no longer be one. Oh, I'm going quick though, that's good. Yes, that's 1+ of this. What can be deduced from the headline ideas? Why bother? That's the question about, why bother? That's cultural studies, isn't it? Why bother looking at this conjuncture? What does racial capitalism do with that? One thing is the idea that inhabiting or deepening differentiation of populations can form part of the fix in response to different crises. We can look back into the history of British cultural studies and look at the ways in which the work around policing the crisis or the Empire Strikes Back do a version of that, to look at the ways in which, in response to a particular kind of moment of either state crisis or global economic crisis, or both, might be what we're having now, that the deepening or inhabiting of the differentiation of populations becomes part of the fix for capital. Not going to talk so much about what that fix might be, but that's a fix that's more than a story. It's a fix that's more than telling you to hate the foreigner. It's actually a structural fix as well. It does certain things to the reach of the state, the distribution of resources, who can be actually enfranchised rather than just feeling like a bit better and seen. That stuff makes a difference. Alongside that, to understand that sedimented histories of dispossession, that's what the history of racism is, how your things are taken from you, including your humanity and your freedom and your ability to live across generations. It becomes sedimented in the histories of how we are positioned, but that's still how we're positioned in the economic landscape. So it's partly a critique of what we think of as economics. So instead of still the fantasy that people enter something called economics with what they're carrying, instead we kind of have a historical lens about what a sedimented history of dispossession might mean for how we think of that. I'm not sure we still know what to do with that, but it's quite an interesting kind of suggestion. Harder to know what to do with that suggestion though, but changes the story. And alongside all of that, the question of how value is stripped differently from human lives becomes part of how we need to understand what capitalism is for all of us, how it splits us, puts us differently, makes our agency differently. And that helps us to both understand both our predicament, because you stop imagining that, oh, well, everyone is going to be the same kind of historical subject eventually. It gives you some resources for understanding the multiple and parallel stories of what that dispossession looks like. And through that, hopefully, I'm always a bit hopeful, you think differently about your possibilities for mobilization. Again, no idea if that makes sense to any of you. You only know when you come to the chat, don't you? So now, the conjuncture is always now, isn't it? That's the thing about it. Who looks at someone else's conjuncture? You're looking at your own. Each of us, endlessly looking at ourselves. I think that one potentially fruitful, and if not fruitful, seemingly unavoidable way to think about our conjuncture is as a failure of infrastructure. And I think we might think of this moment as a kind of blowback or return of the repressed around recent and not so recent histories of racial capitalism. So if we think of racial capitalism as in one aspect leading to those sedimented histories of dispossession that shape opportunities and access to resources of the economic actors of the present, what I just tried to say in the last slide, then there's something about this moment of the failure of infrastructure that uncovers the weak points left by those histories, which are about differentiation. Remember, that's one of the big headlines. People are placed differently, that their histories are carried differently, and that differentiation precisely is what anchors class domination, really. You know, it allows it when things are not working out, when things are in flux, when the institutions are not quite working, the differentiation of populations that you can both rely on and remobilize and inhabit again, they can kind of fix that. Failure of infrastructure does something a bit different. It reveals all the ways in which there are so many weak links in the social formation in terms of just our ability to keep ourselves alive. So for this country, precisely the encouragement of labour market segmentation, I've missed a word out, and a labour market segmentation which is not just a technical one about, oh, you be a cook, I'll be a driver, but a labour market segmentation that is deeply racialised, that is enacted through very violent policies of bordering on purpose, because that's how you let people enter work, not enter work, everyone enters. People, if you even enter in the bottom of a lorry, you're still entering, but you enter the workplace with this highly variegated set of protections and non-protections, of empowerments and non-empowerments, of entitlements and non-entitlements. It's precisely that machinery, which has been Britain for at least the last 40, 45 years, a bit more maybe, that's been exacerbating our current difficulties, because that is one aspect of racial capitalism that has worked to provide institutional, economic, political, and social barriers to the ability to move between kinds of work, so that you create some kinds of work that are so overly structured as the work of the migrant, because who else would do that shit, frankly, that when we come to this moment of infrastructural crisis, that kind of weak link in our very recent history of racial capitalism suddenly becomes apparent. Something that we were all voting for a second ago. I know not all of us, I'm only teasing. I know that's not the crowd tonight. Okay. So sometimes this might mean that infrastructural failure appears to uncover the limits of racial capitalism, as if the conjuncture is, that's another thing, isn't it? Everyone always thinks their conjuncture is the one. This time we're going to get over the hill. I have thought that for several conjunctures in my lifetime already, because I'm that kind of personality. But anyway, this one, who knows, maybe. It uncovers the limits of racial capitalism. So if we consider the willful neglect of infrastructure as an extension or perhaps an adaptation of the processes of dispossession that enable the differentiations of racial capitalism. So racial capitalism partly is a description of how you differentiate populations by saying who counts. You strip value from them differently. For some, that there's a far greater reach into the sphere of social reproduction. For some, there's a different organization around activities that are deemed non-work. For some, there's an extractivism that works from the symbiosis between some populations and natural resources. But across all of that, dispossession makes us differently. So there's something in that failure of infrastructure that shows the ways in which the casting out of racial capitalism, because that differentiation is about saying, you come in, you get out, you get included, even if it's only to be exploited, you F the F off. You know, it's that kind of multiple call and push. There's something in the failure of infrastructure that seems to echo that process of expulsion, which has been a racializing process for lots of places and lots of people. What's distinct, I think, about our moment is that the impact of infrastructural failure goes far beyond the population facing expulsion. That's why it's infrastructural, isn't it? So even if you're the ones coming in, the ones going out, what that then sets into play has quite a lot of impact for those who are seemingly included. So potentially, don't know, I'm not that optimistic, but let's play with this idea. This is an outcome that disrupts racialized hierarchies of entitlement, or at the very least, it does not confirm them in quite the same way. That's what's shifting in our moment. Some of those boundaries of who's in and who's out and who can be safe and who cannot be safe. It's in the queues, isn't it? It's in the empty shelves. It's in the fear about the cost of energy. It's in the fear about whether key utilities are really going to function next year. God, it's in the whether there's a glass bottle for us to have a blood test in. So of course, as always, people always think this about their conjuncture as well, but I want to think it as well. Again, of course, chickens coming home to roost. No part of recent British history which is not about breeding chickens coming home to roost. Infrastructural failure reveals the continuing interdependence of apparently highly differentiated spaces and populations. So racial capitalism arranges us as if we are highly differentiated and not linked to each other, and that non-linkage is productive for a certain kind of replication of social and economic relations. Infrastructural failure reveals that we're connected after all. And it's the knock-on consequences of infrastructural failure that persuade us that this is a failure of infrastructure as opposed to the expulsion or abandonment of a population. If it's the expulsion or abandonment of a population, you can tell it as a more straightforward racial story. You can say it's those poor people. We can be charitable or we can be hateful, but it's them, it's happening to them. Infrastructural failure is always happening to all of us. That I think is worth a second of our attention. Even if we think it's never going to happen to us, just think, oh, that's kind of interesting. What becomes speakable then? What that speakability tells us about possibilities? Because remember, I'm kind of always a bit interested in how telling the story opens some possibility of mobilization. What can I say? I'm a child of the 80s, can't give it up. So we might then consider the moment of infrastructural failure as a folding in of the violence of racial capitalism, bringing some elements of abandonment to all. Right, I'm nearly done. And that looks like loads of writing, but I'm not going to read it all out. What I think we've been living through are some kind of big shifts which lead to this moment of the risk of infrastructural failure. One, a big shift in what we think the productive economy requires. A lot of that has been through the pandemic, but it's likely to continue for some time. A global displacement of precarious and migrant workers with a huge knock-on contraction of or displacement of some sectors, not just here. If you want to really see it, you want to look in the big cities of the global south. All of that fragile equilibrium of the shadow economy is just broken apart. You know, those ways of life, just not there. Everyone who relies on the day labor I do today to eat tonight, it was over. In particular, that very rapid unmaking of the everyday infrastructure through which wage workers outsource their day-to-day bodily needs, cheap transport, sandwich at lunch, cup of tea at break time, someone will sell you some tissues on the journey home in your rickshaw, your auto, or however you're going home, your taxi. All of that up in the air, isn't it? Because the chain of economic activity is not there now. And that whole everyday infrastructure that services the body of waged workers across, I think the cities of the North and the South, is a major and majorly racialized element of everyday urban infrastructure. I think we're living through a moment where we're seeing a kind of reconfigured pattern of services, recongealing, don't know if that's a real word, that's why it's underlined in red, around a changed wage work. If anyone wants to talk about that, I'm desperate to talk about that. Because we, of course, so obvious and barely worth saying, is it? A racial capitalism remade by viral impact. Oh, yawn, yawn, yawn. Who wants to hear that? So some obvious stuff. Changing geography of capitalism, not least as migrants go home, both within nations and across continents. A contraction of the necropolis in the metropolis. Necropolis in the metropolis is the ways in which even the so-called, the seemingly productively orientated urban spaces have to hide within them the spaces of non-work, shadow work, illicit work, criminal work, because without that, the edifice of the urban centre can't hold. And really importantly, a real complication of the previously porous boundary between the so-called productive economy and something like the post-colonial wasteland. Who's coming in and out? Who's feeding us? Who's bringing the dinners? Who's bringing the cheap waged work, the cheap illicit work, the sex work, everything. All of that boundary between the formal economy and all that other stuff. As far as I could see, that all ended for quite a while. And quite a lot of people died, frankly, not of illness, because they couldn't eat. I don't know what to do with that insight. Alongside that, an escalation of technologized shifts, and this is a whole other talk really, but I'll say it, not only the shift to online working, but the insertion of data-led delivery as a core element across sectors. We all need to think about that, don't we? What does that mean? And all of this, we might ask again, what is the work of race? Sorry, I'm going a bit on too far. Race in this moment of racial capitalism. Again, so glaringly obvious, I feel embarrassed to say it out loud, but you can't get to the end without saying it out loud. We know we've lived through a moment in which sedimented dispossession has been embodied as a disproportionate disposability through the pandemic. That's what Black and brown deaths and poor people's deaths and migrant workers' deaths and lower caste deaths mean in this pandemic. That sedimented dispossession is embodied as disproportionate disposability. It was already embodied as that. Pandemic enacts it for you, so you don't need to read any books anymore. Everyone understands that element of racial capitalism now. I think there's an uncertainty about how differentiated entitlement translates into access in this changing map of resources, services, and employment. Because we don't really know what's happening when one big bits of the shadow economy get lost, get remade differently, the place of work changes, the infrastructure of day-to-day social reproduction that is marketized, not sure where that's happening now. But sadly, this is where I sound like the old kind of nostalgic conjunctural analysts of cultural studies say, such periods of rapid transition are very likely to impact disproportionately on those already less enfranchised. That's just how it is, isn't it? Times are bad, people already having a rough time have a rougher time. But this, again, it's like a whole other talk, but I didn't have time to do more. Expulsion and displacement can alter the optics of racial politics. Who you can see, who is living where the boundary is, who is no longer there to be seen in those necropolises of the metropolis. And I think that altered optics of racial politics after the extreme violence of the first phase of a pandemic that is still ongoing, in which the sedimented dispossession was embodied as death for many, that raises very new and different challenges for anti-racism. And I hope that last question even makes sense, but ask me again if it doesn't, because that's really the thing I want to talk about. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Gargi. I'm sitting here wondering if I've slightly misheard you. I don't think I have, but I think I'm sensing a bit of optimism in you, actually. I think I am. You know, in terms of this high visibility of racial capitalism within this contemporary moment, right? As you just said, in relation to during the pandemic, it is clear, you know, what is happening, but at the same time, we can see this, what you're referring to as the willful failure of infrastructure, as, you know, central to the reproduction of racial capitalism. So, you know, it's not just that the chickens are coming home to roost as they always do, but maybe that homecoming is discernible to more at this moment. I don't know. But thank you very much, Gargi. Thank you very much, Anamik. Let's open this out to questions. So if anybody has a question that they would like to ask of Gargi, of Anamik, or to both, you're welcome to use your mic if you would like to do it that way, or to post it in the chat. Any questions? I'm looking, I'm about to abuse the chair.
Don't do that to the chair, Brett.
Well, no.
There was a question in the
I was going
chat.
to say, that all sounds more fun than it ends up being, doesn't it? When they say I'm going to abuse the chair now, and you think, ah. Oh.
No, I'm not going to.
Brett, in the chat, there was a question from Sol. That was from earlier. That has a question for Gargi on infrastructure and another one on, I don't know if you saw that.
Okay. Well,
diversity.
Gargi, do you want to take that question from Sol in the chat? Thoughts around the infrastructure failure? Is the left doing the organizing work necessary to confront this, or is it too engaged with the discourse, the cadaver of the Labour Party?
Well, I think there's two questions in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you cannot, you might fail to do it even if you're not obsessed with the cadaver of the Labour Party, or equally the other way. So let's split those two elements. But of course, no, I think this is a challenge that we're not yet quite at. But having, you know, how we speak to each other in this moment, that's the thing about the conjuncture, isn't it? If you're already doing it, you're kind of on to the next conjuncture probably. But I do think that there are very big challenges for people of good faith. Not even sure I can say the left anymore. You know, people who want to live against people who want to kill. But about what it would mean to safeguard infrastructure or to remake an alternative infrastructure, easier said than done. And I know people say, oh yes, mutual aid, look at the pandemic. Some things can be done through mutual aid. I'm not sure we're at a point where we know how we can do the logistics of a food storage and distribution system that will span the country, or we know what will happen if no one is maintaining our water system, which hasn't already been happening for some time, or that we don't have some of the key, I've forgotten what you call it, but you know, all the frippery of medicine. I was really concerned about, you know, they couldn't do blood tests for quite a long time in this country because we didn't have enough glass vials. Now that is, what do we do with that knowledge? Now I think we do have to do something, because that's our job, isn't it, to use knowledge to ensure our mutual survival and freedom. But I'm not sure if it's happening. It's not part of a set of conversations that I am very centrally in yet, and I'd like to be in them. And if not, I'd like us to start them, because who wants, you know, you all know what will happen if we don't start them.
Anamik, there's that second part of the question from Sol in relation to discourses of diversity as Tory hegemony enters its more authoritarian mode. Would you like to take that?
I mean, obviously, Sol uses the example of Birbal Singh's appointment to be social mobility, what was it, social mobility chief, I think it was. And they are an outspoken opponent of so-called wokeism. I've got to be honest with you, that's what I'm just finding really fascinating, because I'm not seeing evidence of this inside cultural industry. I mean, yeah, okay, newspaper industry, there's always been a pretty explicit alliance between, you know, the right-wing government and then particular sections of the press, in terms, not least in terms of editorship and indeed ownership. But there just seems to be like a counter shift going on in media. Like I said, this obsession with diversity, which comes from this feeling of, you know, we can capitalize on this, we can use more mixed race couples to sell DFS, you know, sofas in DFS ads, you know what I mean? You know, there's that. But then also there's a fear and anxiety that if we don't do this, the very legitimacy of our organization is under threat. And, you know, and my research, I've kind of, you know, I see kind of, maybe I'm exaggerating here, but you know, these cultural managers, creative managers kind of scrambling to reorganize the organization of cultural production so it can meet these new demands. And so there is some, it's like when Disney, you know, when Disney do those trigger warnings for all those, you know, racist films in their back catalogue, right? You know, and why are they doing that? And they've been obviously the usual suspects accused them of being woke this, woke that. But they wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't the economic, you know, an economic kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Urgency, you know, to correct their catalogue in that way. And that says to me that they've kind of caught a sense of the way the wind's blowing in terms of a particular, you know, their particular audience, and in terms of what they want to consume. Now, of course, you know, this isn't a kind of, you know, romantic celebration of popular culture that I want to present to you, because a lot of the culture that's still being made is deeply, you know, still plays on reductive historical tropes of, you know, race and otherness and so on, which I find deeply troubling. But nonetheless, it does feel like a countercurrent. I'm not sure to what extent the authoritarianism of the current government, you know, in what way, I'm not saying it's going to be battered off, but it will shape. I'm not sure how, because it just seems to be going counter. And that, you know, that's a form of optimism there. But also, like I said, I've kind of got slight cynicism over an anti-racist politics that's based on whether enough, you know, whether or not black or brown excellence is being awarded at the BAFTAs. You know, that's not, I don't really give a shit about that, truth be told. But nonetheless, there is something there. And that's, like I said, when I want to think through those ambivalences, because in doing so, when we identify those cracks and ambivalences, that's when you can prise open that stuff. So the way in which, you know, sorry, I'm rabbiting on now, but the way, you know, everyone's on the diversity bandwagon, this is across, whether it's media, finance, charity sector, whatever, everyone's on board with it. But the minute you mention positive discrimination or affirmative action, you get a very different response. People all of a sudden get very, very defensive. No, we don't need to go that far. We'll just continue trying. You know, they see diversity as an add-on, but they don't actually want to change anything. So by identifying that threat to society's very sense of meritocracy, I think that's something that can be leveraged open in potentially productive ways. But yeah, that's the work of, you know, that's what this work's all about, I think. Finding those cracks which we can get a crowbar. Yeah.
Thanks, Anamik. Do we have any other questions? Anybody we still have half an hour, so we still have plenty of time to...
Hello? Yes,
Hello?
please.
Jenny, would
Yes,
you like
please.
to ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, it was an awful lot of information to take in very rapidly. But there is one thing that has been puzzling me for a while and which I've been looking at. We've had a wave of things. First, we got the Black movement in the States. Then came the gay pride in Brighton, let's say, you know, showing their solidarity. You got the Not Me, Me Too movement from the women that brought up a whole lot of things, and so on and so on. But I'm Dutch and I've lived in England for 60 years, but I'm still treated as a foreigner. It's not racism because I'm as white as they are. But I get it all the time in a very subtle way. And it's a phrase that we all laugh at because it starts, well, but she's Dutch after all. You know, well, he's African after all, you know. And that is nothing to do with whether you're black or white. It's to do with difference. And in my article, I've called it Otherism. You know, if you're other, there is a boundary there, you're different. And yet, on the other hand, all our culture is bound on, we go into nature to find different kind of animals, different kind of plants. We go to different countries to see different things. I mean, it's almost that otherism, as I see it, is the pejorative definition of diversity. And I'm not sure why it is, unless you look right at the beginning, when people actually colonized and found different people and were obviously puzzled, as it happened quite often, those different people in their view were less educated. So there was a relation between having a different color and being at a different stage of capital development, say. But all that is at the bottom of it. And I think it's very difficult to talk just about racism, because it isn't all about racism, it's about diversity and how people don't want anybody to be other. They find it very difficult to have relationships. And on the other hand, they exploit it because, I mean, at the moment, it's sometimes ridiculous. If you look at programs, television programs, there is far more Black people or colored people of any kind than there are around, you know, disproportionate. And it's obviously because it makes money. And it's no good. I mean, you got to look at it from a capitalist point of view. Anything that will make money will go. But to me, what we're doing at the moment, we have gay people saying, look at us, but we're emphasizing our differences all the time. And if we want to get somewhere, we got to emphasize what's similar between us, what binds us. But where is the movement that actually says, you're Black and white, but what have we got in common? Or you're Dutch and you're English, what have we got in common? Or whatever it is, you're a woman, I'm a man. With those people, what have we got in common? And it seems to me to begin to think positively, we got to think about, not about otherness, but about sameness. What is it that we share that is intrinsically human and is positive? And I didn't hear any of that. It's all kind of, you know, about differences. But to me, differences need to be approached from the point of view, how can we show what we got in common and what is positive?
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for that. Gargi, Anamik, would you like to respond to that at all?
I mean, just very quickly, I mean, it's about, I mean, you said it, you know, we're all human, right? You know, that's what you said. But I guess the point is, and this is what, it's racial capital, you know, just any kind of, the major learning from race critical theories is that precisely some of us have been denied that humanity.
That what, sorry?
Have been denied.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's, you know, doing, and I really like, you know, Gargi's word of sedimentation, just like, you know, think of it as different, like just layers and layers and layers and layers of history that have led us to this. So how do you undo that? And it's going to take a lot more work than simply just kind of declaring our sameness. You know, I think there's a lot of work, not least the excavation necessary in order to exactly show how particular types of groups of people have been devalued, you know, and then, you know, and then finding ways in which we can kind of better live together. And one of the reasons why I'm so invested in the question of culture and media more than perhaps most people in this room now is because precisely that it helps restore humanity to the people who've denied it. But when capitalism gets involved in the production of culture, you know, if it, you know, since the birth of capitalism generally, you know, what does that do then to our ability to tell those narratives? But yeah, I wish it was that simple. But Gargi, do you want to?
I think, well, certainly the way I think about racial capitalism as a way of trying to understand things is not really about difference or sameness. But I often say this, so forgive me for people who have heard me say it before, that racial capitalism is a way of describing how we're all living shit lives, but in different ways, and how the shitness of our parallel lives are connected. So that it is absolutely a version of a universalist is wrong, but a totalizing account that tries to encompass different histories and talk about shit lives lived in parallel. And what is the living in parallel, you know, the overcoming of the living in parallel is freedom. So, you know, anyway.
Thanks. Gargi, if you can see in the chat, there's a question from Chris asking you to expand on the data-led transformation of work that you referred to and how you think this is going to be reflected in racial terms.
So I don't know the answer to that. So I was hoping that other people might have a chat about it. I mean, clearly there's people doing much better work, you know, more intensive work than me about how platform economies then kind of inhabit already racialized labor markets. That Dalia Gabriel's work is all about that. There's other people working on it. Some of the new work that Autonomy have put out a recent pamphlet book about, you know, one of the people in Autonomy about globally how that has worked. I wasn't talking about all of work. I was talking about the ways in which one of the aspects of the pandemic that has remade really a huge amount of economic activity is data-led delivery processes, because people are spatially dispersed differently. And that links into infrastructure, but it adds a different aspect because we haven't previously always had, we didn't see storage, transportation, logistics as delivery in such an intensive way as we do in our moment. And of course, that whole system is intensively datafied in ways that make the ability to do that, moving distribution, storage, logistics, moving this to there, that to there. Then what we need to know in order to do that makes that data differently valuable than we have. I don't think we've ever known that. I don't think any previous moment of production had that level of integration between data analysis and data management and predictive data and those things. And I think that is interesting. And what will it do racially? I'm not sure. I think it's uncertain. I do think, look, we know that all of the, so much sign that the people who are most employed in those kinds of differently precarious kinds of work are people who are already disadvantaged in the labour market. So yes, racially disadvantaged because of their migration status, disadvantaged because of other long-standing disadvantages in terms of work. But also it's absolutely remaking the whole terrain of work. And I don't know what that means yet. Because in every, it's back to this thing that, you know, Joan Robertson, this quite middle of the road economist says, and I do say it elsewhere, and saying all the things I say all the time, that the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. So when labour markets change, even if you're entering them in a rubbishy way, with work that doesn't quite pay your way of life, horrible, dangerous, that you can die any day and there's no recompense to your family, that is still entering a labour market that others will not enter. And I think we're living in that kind of shift, that the shift in where work is and who will enter that work. And that I think is still being decided, how that then maps onto long histories of racialized dispossession. And it might not be in as predictable a way as people think. Which doesn't mean optimism or pessimism. It just means if you're going to call something the conjuncture, you know, come for the conjuncture.
I was just going to add to that. Gargi, from what I understand, you were talking about kind of entry into labour markets, how that's becoming datafied. I mean, there's a whole literature on, like, you know, from digital racism, race studies, which has kind of looked at the ways in which consumption is kind of an access to information and services and products is kind of a process now through algorithmic culture, and how those kind of algorithms, supposedly neutral, objective kind of processes have racial codes hardwired into them, such that it prevents people from entering nations, or whether getting a credit card or a mortgage, you know, and that's all based on these algorithms which have been designed to process huge amounts of data very quickly. That's the whole purpose of them, right? But are based on kind of inputs that are based on racial tropes. So having an ethnically sounding name and living in a particular zip code, as Rua Benjamin shows, means, showed in this particular point in American history, means that you end up in a database for potential gang members, right? And you can see that again, that's going on with Prevent in the UK. So, I'm not sure if that's what the kind of the data-led transformations that Gargi was referring to, but definitely it's evident in people's ability to access, racialized populations' ability to access different types, as I say, services, products, privileges.
Anamik, while you're here, can I just put to you another question that's been raised in the chat, specifically for you, regarding ambivalence in one of your responses, and whether you see the power of ambivalence happening across sites, everyday, popular, production, and so on, or whether you see certain sites being able to have or contain more ambivalence than others?
That's a really good question. I think I'm referring to ambivalence as the very, in the everyday. I think that is evident, but I think that question of whether certain sites are more characterized by ambivalence or contain more ambivalence, I'm not even sure if that makes sense. It's a really interesting one, and I'm not sure if I've got a really useful response to that. I might need to dwell on that a bit more. Do you have any? Do any of you guys have anything you might want to say about that while I think of a interesting response?
Anyone?
Could I ask Sarah if she could unpack that? I don't know if she wants to. I don't want to put our members on the audience members on the spot, but
I'm just literally eating my dinner as I'm listening. The reason I asked is because I've been thinking about ambivalence in relation to representations of feminism, and been using your work, Anamik, actually to think about kind of structural ambivalence versus kind of the actual content, and how the content and the representation also contains ambivalence. So yeah, I've just been thinking about ambivalence a lot, and I caught what you said, and I was wondering whether you thought that are you talking about it in the everyday, how like people take up or don't take up messages, or are you thinking about it in a different way? I was just interested.
Yeah, I think across the board, Sarah, actually. I think across the board. So I guess my reading of ambivalence, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but I see it as, when a particular phenomenon has two opposing kind of outcomes at the same time, sometimes. And that's kind of, pretty much, I think, the two tensions. And it's about how we can harness the really disruptive ones. For me, that's politically, I think that's the outcome. Sometimes you can just, I totally overuse that word, and it doesn't, I think it, like politically speaking, doesn't necessarily produce anything concrete, but at the same time, I think it is about identifying them and harnessing them, or, to use a quote by I shouldn't like prize them open. And yeah, so I think, sorry, Sarah, that's a really weak answer, but all of those.
No, not at all.
Sorry, get back to your dinner, Sarah.
Thanks, Anamik. Thanks, Sarah. Gargi, there's a question from Robert in the chat for you, asking how you're developing your thesis about race, dispossession, and infrastructure, and asking about possible future directions and whether you can point us to any literature.
Oh, of course I can't. That's why it's just one slide on the talk, because that's the thing I can't write at the moment. I am trying to write it. I might have this book here. It doesn't really talk about race that much, but I do love it. This, people seen it, Politics of Operations by Mazadra and Nielsen. I don't know if, can you see it? That one's, sometimes when you hate a book because you didn't write it, but this is one of those books. Admitted it, but I'm not a generous reader. I'd like you all to write crappy books so I can think, I can write better than that. But I'm trying to think about shifts in infrastructure because I think it's a different way of thinking, or not a different way. I just think it's the question of our time, isn't it? So if you want to be someone like me who wants to try to grasp how capitalism remakes itself in our time, then I have to look at the question of infrastructure. I think that I haven't seen much that explicitly talks about race and infrastructure. And also I was going to, I do hear what Anamik is saying about, of course, I'm very indebted and grateful for all of the work about digital racism, but I'm not completely sold on this, but my hunch is, or the anxiety that I'm trying to kind of live with, work with, is that I think some of the work on digital racism is still based around an implicit assumption that there could be a functioning politics, a political terrain and an economic terrain in which we all get to be human, and that discriminatory technologies come and stop some of us doing that. That isn't what I believe. As you know, I believe that the terrain is made to be differentiated, that there's no opening of the door or no kind of taking away the discriminate, oh, just get the face recognition technology right and then we've done it. That's not my position. I suspect it's not your position either, is it really? So then it's like, okay, given that we're learning all this really good stuff from the digital racism stuff, and yet it leads us to that conclusion. And what's her face, and I'm grateful that she, surveillance capitalism person, I'm grateful she wrote that great big fat book, but basically, we'll be a bit rude now, basically her argument is bit more privacy, bit more regulation, democracy works, hey ho, liberal capitalism, isn't it? Kind of. That can't be our position. That cannot put, that's not a sustainable position. However many great stories about Google you put in there, that cannot be our politics. And so therefore we have to think a bit differently about when we say technology remakes the space of the economic, what does that mean? And I think it partly does mean that it throws everything up in the air a bit. So what economic inclusion might mean for everyone might change, might be even worse for everyone. That's what some of this, that's what I take from Mackenzie Walk's stuff about capitalism is dead. Really, she's saying, you think this is bad? Let me tell you what's coming next. Oh my word. I think that's kind of a plausible account. I can't live with it, but hear it because it's a plausible account. But it, to think about infrastructure is also to think about what is the remaking of capital and what is the remaking of life? When do those things coincide? When do they not coincide? What do we learn from the non-coincidence? Talking too much.
No, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And there's a wonderful question from Raheel in the chat as well, which is, in a sense, asking you to carry on. And Anamik, if you want to come in on this as well. If you're talking about the problems of politics on an inclusion agenda, right? And let's tweak, as you said, more privacy, better regulation, and so on and so forth. There's a wonderful question here from Raheel saying, I've been indebted to Saidiya Hartman's work, ideas around subversion and rebellion in the midst of violence, and her work in excavating these stories. I wondered if there were any thoughts on how to build subversive infrastructure and storytelling. I think that's in my opinion, that's a wonderful question. Gargi, do you want to say anything to that?
No, absolutely. It is a wonderful question. I think it's far more in the register of what I'd hope all of us carry on talking about, because there's one way of talking about infrastructural failure, which says, oh, woe is us, we have no electoral vehicle, let us lie down and die. As you can imagine, I'm not so keen on that one. There's other ways of saying, oh, infrastructural failure, kind of seen versions of this before, but perhaps not for some of you in the room. What can we learn from those who've lived with the non-coincidence of the remaking of capital and the remaking of life through these sedimented histories of dispossession, which I hear that in Raheel's question about all of those ideas of fugitive politics, subversive infrastructure, that the Black radical tradition is precisely about that, which is the other side of the account of racial capitalism, is to say there are ways of thinking about surviving and being human that have existed and continue to exist. They're not the purchase of any one location. Some of them we haven't even excavated them yet, but they are part of how we must think about learning what we mean by an infrastructure for all that maintains life in the face of violence. Yeah, absolutely. I think that must be our collective project. And storytelling's part of it. I don't think storytelling is all of it, but I think we have to have ways of speaking to each other, and storytelling is, as you say, is one of the ways in which you excavate ways of knowing and being in the world which have so far not really had an institutional footing because they exist in the other stuff. Jokes. I want to write a whole bit about racial capitalism and jokes, and I keep getting caught up in it, but I think there's something to be said about when we laugh, some of us live. And I hope, despite my misery, you take that away from this evening.
Thanks, Gargi. Anamik, is there anything that you would like to say in relation to this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with what Gargi was saying there about storytelling. So if I could, I'd pose it then in terms of what can we do to give people, for minoritized groups, the modes to cultural production, if you like, ownership over the modes of cultural production, if I put it in those terms. And as I kind of ranted about in the first half hour, diversity is not cutting it. It's seen as an add-on rather than a transformative thing. At the moment, I mean, as much as while we're showing ideas, and Gargi, I really hope you get to write about jokes at some point. I mean, there's plenty in your book, to be fair. I mean, that's definitely one of the unique interventions, most important interventions. It's like, yeah, this writing can be funny at times. But what was I saying? Oh, crap. Jokes are just, yeah. So I've been reading up about, I don't know if I'm going to run with this or not, but I've been reading up about reparative justice as a kind of, if I'm thinking diversity is totally benign and actually deeply ideological, what would a more radical form of that look like? And I'm kind of turning to this idea of reparative justice. What would that look like? Not least it would kind of, and this might be really, really heavy-handed, but if Spivak taught us, though, she seems to distance herself from this argument that subaltern cannot speak. What would it take to enable the subaltern to speak in this current conjunctural mode? And and this is something that post-colonialists, I don't think they still can't really get their head around, is that so much culture making is made in the context of capitalism. You cannot remove it. It's not culture making is not this autonomous thing that we need to protect from. It, it's happening under capitalist conditions. Even, I say it's my first book, even the grime artist who's selling, I don't know if they actually sell white labels anymore, but selling white labels from the back of their van, that is still a form of commodity. That's a commodity and a process of commodification. So I'm really interested in this idea of reparative justice as a way of the state taking responsibility for the kind of racial violence, racial marginalization, exclusions that it enacted through slavery, through colonialism, and so on. And as a form of reparation to the ancestors of those people who also continue to encounter racialized violence, exclusions and marginalization in their everyday lives now. And actually being able to kind of facilitate the creation of new forms of production, whatever they might be. There's been an amazing, it's always been present. It's not a novel thing, like the emergence of like independent record labels or journalistic platforms or so on. But there has been there's been a technological transformation that has enabled those modes, those different types of production. What would it, would a form of reparative justice be around kind of, as a part of kind of taking ownership over history, a way of like buoying up those kind of platforms which do give the most autonomy to the people who are most minoritized, marginalized in society to tell the stories that they want to tell in the way that they want to tell them. I think that's where my thinking is. And that, I'll let you know how I get on in a month or two. So I'm spending my sabbatical reading up on this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Anamik. We're inside our final 5 minutes now. So
Brett, can I just say there was a couple of questions that you missed from which I think quite interesting about the global aspect. So Professor Udemukwu kind of asked about what does the theories of racial capitalism might entered discourse of ethnic politics in the context of West Africa. And David Hesmanhauch kind of followed up thinking about what does the rise of China as an economic military power, and also maybe India, how does that shed light, or what kind of light does that shed on our understanding of racial capitalism in this conjunction? I don't have the answers to any of those things, but I thought they're really interesting.
Well, do you want to say something very small in response to that very big question?
Yeah. Again,
the rise of China, maybe India.
I mean, I can't speak for Professor Udamuku's kind of question about specificness of Western Africa. I mean, again, if I'm sorry to put it back to the media, but that is the only, I feel like I can talk fairly confidently on issues of media. I mean, the recognition of China as a market, and Gargi, you wrote about this in your book, I feel like, but the recognition of those spaces as markets, and to what extent do racial logics feed into those? I guess I'd want to talk about the kind of increasing emphasis on domestic culture industries, where like streaming platforms like Netflix recognize that these local culture industries, especially like India and so on, where there are relatively big budgets, but also we're seeing this across their Netflix coming into like the African continent and through South America and so on, and kind of cultivating these sites as potential, as sources of content. And this is what it's all about. And Gargi's point on differentiation is bang on. But also within those countries, how there's racial logics at play. And I'm thinking of, again, sorry to go lowbrow, but well, no, this isn't lowbrow at all. This is actually really, but if you look at the way in which there's been all the controversy around kind of anti-blackness in K-pop, right, and how that's circulating around the global cultural economy, and that's a lot to do with the kind of the American racial hegemon, if you like. So those are just some things I throw out there. But I'm
sorry to be. I am sometimes miserable, but I'm a bit telly-offy today. I'm not sure why. But I am also very cheerful, and I'm so pleased that you noticed the jokes on Anamik, because that is my real contribution on my deathbed, to say that person, for all of the telling off, there were some good jokes here and there. But we can't, I can't tell it in a not telling offy way. India and China are both engaged in, if not actual genocide, borderline genocide on racialized grounds. They both occupy territory in highly racialized ways, which dispossess people of their lives, let alone their land. That is absolutely built into the reclaiming of the globe as the Asian century through those two new superpowers. But racialization is not read on the body in the ways that we might think if we only read North American critical race theory or cultural studies. If we understand that, we might as well give up and go home. Race is a fiction that is used as a technique of power that will distribute and give meaning to bodies, and those bodies will be different, and it will change, and it's not decided yet. And the idea that the coming of China and the coming of India on Netflix, it is anything but some new hegemons with some new racialized violences built into it. It's beneath us, isn't it? I know none of you really think that, but as it's been a long evening and I know my dinner needs to be finished cooking on the stove, my kids fed and things, let's just say that to each other. We need to say that to each other. Some urgent stuff here that if we're going to talk about the conjuncture, that is also the conjuncture, isn't it? We're going to say that we had a meeting at this moment in 2021 about the pissing conjuncture and racial capitalism. And we might be the people, the generation who, despite all of the many never agains, lived through the wiping out of the Uyghur people. How long has Kashmir been in lockdown? Kashmir hasn't had internet for the whole pandemic. So we don't even know who's lived or died in that moment. So that doesn't mean, we're not going to fix it by talking about it, but that's our conjuncture. It's not someone else's conjuncture, that's ours too, alongside Squid Games and all the other stuff. That's the job of cultural studies, to know the global, to know the corporate, and also to know the texture of the everyday. That must be our job. I don't know why I'm so telling off. I was saying to other people, I have some quite painful residual feelings about British cultural studies for all kinds of personal biographical reasons, I do apologise for bringing them out in front of you, because it's not any of your fault. I'll try and be in better spirits if we ever meet again.
Thank you very much, Gargi. And in you saying that and opening this up, just as it's time for us to close down. So in that sense, I hope that we all do get to meet again soon. Thank you, Gargi. Thank you, Anamik, for your wonderful presentations, provocations, the generosity of your responses. Thanks to everybody for your participation, for your questions, for your engagement. I personally have a sense that, you know, even though it's time for us to wrap up now, that we could now really continue on. So hopefully we'll find some time in the future to do so. I would just like to also, in wrapping up, remind you of the forthcoming New Formations online seminars in the This Conjuncture series in upcoming weeks. Next is Patriarchy in the Digital Conjuncture, followed by Perspectives from Mexico, and then Woke Capitalism. So we hope that you will be able to join us, if not for all, for at least some of those, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, Gargi, thank you, Anamik, and thank you everybody for engaging. Thanks very much.